Las Malvinas, or otherwise known as the Falkland Islands, an archipelago of islands situated on the Patagonian shelf of the South Atlantic Ocean, a mere couple hundred kilometers from Argentine soil. With a population of just 2,840 people, 3 times smaller than that of Riverston, and a landmass 200 kilometers smaller than that of Sydney, how and why would two global powers erupt into a conflict over a set of islands whose original purpose was to serve as a naval repair base for British vessels over 257 years ago? To construct a better context and understanding of the Falklands and eventual conflict, we must first understand the history of the islands and the surrounding predicaments in both the United Kingdom and Argentina leading up to the conflict itself. The Falkland Island Navy Base was established over 257 years ago by British sea mariners and Royal Navy officer John Byron. In a period of major imperial expansion and colonialism on behalf of the United Kingdom, the Falkland settlement, and notably Port Egmont, served to repair British Navy vessels and take on supplies from Lower Atlantic and South American ventures. After a sequence of external claims to sovereignty to the island by that of allies Spain and France, Britain seceded the islands to Spain in a scaling level of physical tension. With events commencing such as the American Revolutionary War and evacuation of Spanish control on the islands, the Falklands became the simple dominion of whalers, sealers, and brave horsemen known as gauchos for a number of years leading up to the independence of Argentina. Argentina, or prior to the time of their independence from Spain, were firmly recognized as the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, or the territory of the River Plate. Originally a South American colony of Spain, Argentina vied for their independence in a series of brutal conflicts and campaigns, which saw the royalist Spanish monarchy succumb to the Argentine emancipation for independence. A mere 5 years later, Argentina, what would be known at the time as the now United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, steered their gaze southeast to the somewhat uninhabited and neglected islands of the Falklands. Louis Vinet, a somewhat controversial figure in the sovereignty dispute over the islands, would be granted by Argentina the right to establish a settlement and capitalize off the cattle roaming the islands. Through the support of the somewhat eager merchant on the islands, Argentina had attracted the attention of Britain, who was swift in their reassertion and claim of sovereignty over the islands, only adding to the brewing dispute. The United Kingdom asserted sovereignty over the islands for the remainder of the 19th century, and this was consequently assisted by the diplomacy seen in the Aranyas Southern Treaty of 1850. This treaty was signed in the aftermath of the British and French military involvement in suppressing Argentine blockades in 1850. Historians and those familiar with the history of the Falklands consider this particular treaty a key event in the history of the dispute over the Falklands, as from the Argentine perspective, it effectively gave the islands to Britain in the hopes of ending the blockade conflict. However, from an alternate view, the British expected the islands, as they claimed sovereignty before Argentina had even claimed independence. Fast track to the 20th century, and the issue of sovereignty over the islands isn't revisited until a statement to Congress made by that of the Argentine Confederation in 1941. This is the first time the matter is brought to light since the British-Argentine diplomatic treaty was signed 90 years prior. 1947 to 1955 saw multiple attempts at referring the dispute over the islands to the ICJ, or International Court of Justice, all of which were declined by Argentina. With having now established the history of the islands and the quarrelling dispute of sovereignty in both the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, the Falkland Islands, the war, and what they represent to both Argentina and the UK can be further understood by examining the predicaments in both countries just years prior to the Argentine invasion. Great Britain, or in the late 70s, early 80s, not so Great Britain. What's referred to as the UK's super recession of the 80s, where unemployment skyrocketed over 3 million people and analysts were calling it the worst period of economic growth since World War II. Margaret Thatcher, a key figure in the conflict and the dealing of the Falklands War, is widely regarded as a controversial yet tough in the face of opposition character. With her Conservative administration undergoing endless criticism and susceptibility to failure due to the conditions of the British economy, many expected Thatcher and her government to last no longer than a year. In addition, the British government made proposals to curb military spending at £1 billion, a direct fracture in the promise of military spending goals established by NATO. A failing economy, mistrust in their elected leader, and proposals to cut military spending set the stage for the newly established military junta in Argentina over 8,000 miles away to reassess what they believed to be their right to the islands. Although everything was aligning for the Argentinians to claim sovereignty over the islands once again, none of the factors were more important than the economical and political status of Argentina, stemming from the mid-70s to early 80s. In a brutal and harsh overthrow of their previous government, The Argentine coup d'etat saw the deaths of over 30,000 young men and women. In a period that is now known as the Dirty War, Jorge Videla and his military dictatorship assumed power over Argentina following the deposed President Isabella Perón. In a matter of years, the newly appointed president and dictator of Argentina, Leopoldo Galtieri, was immediately faced with similar challenges to the UK. A collapse of financial markets, depreciating currency, and similar to the Thatcher circumstances, a growing amount of mistrust and opposition in the government. So in an attempt to rally, distract, and invoke feelings of patriotism, loyalty, and support around a single nationwide objective, Leopoldo Galtieri on April 2, 1982, gave the green light for the invasion of the Falkland Islands. By late April, the number of Argentine troops on the island amassed over 10,000. The train of thought shared nationwide was that there would be a lack of retaliation, or if lucky, zero retaliation. They were utterly wrong. It can be attributed to the woman in charge of the UK at the time, Margaret Thatcher, for the response that was immediately assumed. Thatcher and her cabinet immediately declared a 200 nautical mile exclusion zone around the islands. This would later lead to a controversy, with the largest loss of life in the conflict, the sinking of the Belgrano, occurring outside this exclusion zone. Naval, air, and ground combat lasted for a total of 10 weeks. From the combination of strategy and skill on behalf of the SAS, Royal Marines, and SBS, Britain were able to score a number of key victories on the road to reclamation of the Falklands. Exocet missiles rained down on the British ships, whilst RAF Sea Harriers attempted to shoot down the Argentinian jets. The HMS Sheffield was sunk by one of these missiles and marked the first British vessel sunk since World War II. Raids at Goose Green and Port Stanley proved consequential in the British victory, and on the 14th of June 1982, the remaining Argentine forces surrendered, rendering the Falklands under British rule once again. The significance of the Falklands War and the military effort from both Argentina and the UK did not come without its consequences. The lasting effect on both parties can still be felt in the 21st century. Argentina still claimed the islands as their own, and diplomacy on behalf of both sides has proved ineffective. Argentina suffered the consequences of gambling the likelihood of their regime on what they thought to be a justified war and consequently failed, whereas the Falklands War and Thatcher's dealing of the conflict would cement Margaret Thatcher as a tough and firm leader, giving way to her moniker, the Iron Lady. Her particular dealing of the repercussions of the conflict would benefit her in the most positive way imaginable. Not only was it a victory for Britain, but it was a victory for her government and would allow her to continue her term as Prime Minister and give way to the popular British ideology known as Thatcherism. The Falklands War plays on the notion and ideas of insignificance and unimportance associated with the islands. Revisiting the question from earlier, how and why would two global powers erupt into a conflict over a seemingly insignificant set of islands, it proves that the Falklands War was more than just a conflict based on territorial disputes. The already existing circumstances, both politically and economically, on a nationwide level from either party, proved to be a dominating factor. Leopoldo Galtieri stated in the aftermath of the Argentinian loss, "Personally, I judged that a British retaliation was improbable. However, I never expected such a disproportionate response. Nobody expected it. Why would a nation in the heart of Europe be affected by some distant islands in the Atlantic which serve no national interest? I don't think it makes sense. This is because the Falklands set the grounds for more than a conflict over some islands in the Atlantic. It was an amalgamation of surrounding predicaments and lasting decisions which would go on to leave a lasting impression on both the British and Argentine governments of that era and the years following."